Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, has snow ever settled outside your own window, hushing the world into stillness? Watson once learned that snow conceals nothing. It only waits, patient, for someone willing to read it. Do subscribe, so no quiet truth escapes you. We're also warmly on Spotify. The link awaits in the description below. Now, lean closer. For as Holmes believed, the smallest detail preserved is often the truth itself. The snowbound house at Blackthorn Mere. It is a curious thing in the retelling of old cases, how often the memory of weather outlasts the memory of words. I can recall with perfect clarity the particular whiteness of that January sky, and the way the wind came off the marshes at Blackthorn Mere like some living thing testing the shutters for a way in, long after I have forgotten the precise phrases with which Sherlock Holmes first laid the matter before me. It was, I believe, one of the coldest winters that Hertfordshire had known in a decade, and it was into the very heart of that cold that Holmes and I travelled, upon an invitation as courteous as it was mysterious. The invitation came from Sir Edmund Vale, a magistrate of long-standing and unimpeachable reputation, whose name I had encountered more than once in the law reports, always attached to some judgment remarkable for its fairness. Holmes had received a letter from him some days before, written in a hand that betrayed even to my unpractised eye a certain anxious pressure of the pen. "He does not say what troubles him, Watson," Holmes remarked, passing the letter across the breakfast table, "which is itself the most eloquent part of the communication. A man who can describe his trouble writes plainly. A man who cannot writes like this." He tapped the paper. "Observe how the sentences shorten toward the end, as though the hand were being drawn along faster than the mind could properly govern it. I confess I saw only a request, civilly worded, that Holmes should come down to Blackthorn Mere at his earliest convenience, the matter being, in Sir Edmund's words, of a delicacy I should prefer not to commit further to paper." Holmes saw, as he so often did, the whole shape of a man's anxiety folded into the manner of its concealment. We arrived at the estate in the late afternoon, the last mile accomplished by a hired trap, whose driver seemed glad enough to set us down and turn back toward the village before the light failed entirely. Blackthorn Mere itself was a long, low house of grey stone, half swallowed by ancient pines, with the frozen marshland stretching away behind it like a sheet of beaten pewter. Even as we descended from the trap, the first true violence of the storm began, a hard, dry snow driven almost horizontal by the wind, and by the time we had been shown into the hall by a solemn manservant, the world beyond the windows had already begun to disappear. "You're fortunate in your timing, gentlemen," said Sir Edmund, coming forward to greet us with a warmth that could not quite disguise the tightness about his eyes. He was a tall man, spare and grey, with the deliberate measured bearing of one long accustomed to weighing evidence before he spoke. "Another hour and the road would have been closed to you altogether. As it is, I fear none of us shall be going anywhere for some days." He was correct, as we soon learned. By nightfall the telegraph wire was down, snapped somewhere among the pines, and the lane to the village had vanished beneath drifts that no cart could hope to pass. We were, in effect, sealed within that house together with its household and its guests, a circumstance which Holmes, I observed, received with far more interest than alarm. The company assembled that evening in the long drawing-room was a small one, but each member of it seemed determined to appear entirely at ease, which had, paradoxically, the effect of suggesting that none of them were. Lady Vale, Sir Edmund's wife, was a handsome woman of perhaps 45, dignified in her bearing and gracious in her speech, though I noted that her hands, when she poured the tea, were not quite steady. Mr. Alistair Crowe, the family solicitor, was a neat, precise little man who spoke of the weather with the same careful exactness he might have brought to a deed of conveyance. Miss Helena Price, governess to a niece of the house, sat somewhat apart, her manners polished, but her eyes watchful. Captain Lionel Harbury, a retired officer with a soldierly moustache and a hearty laugh, filled every silence that threatened to fall too long. Dr. Silas Wrentham, the local physician, was quiet and observant in a professional way, and Mr. Arbel Marston, the estate steward, said little, and seemed to wish to say less. It was Captain Harbury who first mentioned over the soup the name of Thomas Rusk, and I noticed at once how the table's easy chatter contracted, as a hand contracts about something it does not wish to drop. "Poor fellow," said the captain, with what struck me as slightly overdone regret. "A sad business. The bridge, the ice, that sort of thing. Still, the inquest settled it well enough. Accident. Plain and simple." "Plain and simple," Lady Vale echoed, in a voice a shade too even. Holmes said nothing at the time, but I saw his grey eyes move once, briefly, from face to face about the table, and I knew that look. It was the look he wore when a room contained more silence than conversation, and when that silence had been arranged, with great and unconscious care, by everyone within it. It was not until later, when the ladies had withdrawn and the gentlemen sat over their port, that Sir Edmund at last came to the matter that had summoned us. He drew from his coat a folded paper and laid it upon the table between us. "I have had 3 of these, Mr. Holmes," he said, "each by a different post, each unsigned." He unfolded it, and I read in a plain, unremarkable hand a single sentence. The inquest did not hear all that was seen. Holmes took up the paper and held it to the lamp, turning it this way and that, his long fingers tracing the folds with the particular tenderness he reserved for objects that might yet be made to speak. "The paper is common enough," he said at last, "to be bought at any stationer's in the country, but the folds are not common at all. See here, Watson, how the creases run, not as a letter is folded for an envelope, but as though the sheet had lain pressed for some time within the leaves of a narrow volume, a legal volume, I should think, by the proportion of the fold." He looked up at Sir Edmund, and his voice, though quiet, carried an edge I had heard before, upon the threshold of every great case. "Tell me, Sir Edmund, was the inquest testimony ever bound?" Sir Edmund's face in that instant went the colour of the snow beyond the glass, and I understood that the storm without, however fierce, was as nothing to the one that had already begun within the walls of Blackthorn Mere. Chapter 2. A Polite Prison of Snow. Morning at Blackthorn Mere came grey and reluctant, the light seeming to seep through the curtains rather than break upon them, and when I rose and drew back the drapes of my room I found the world outside transformed into something almost featureless. The lawns, the box hedges, the low stone wall that marked the edge of the drive, all had vanished beneath a smooth and even whiteness, broken only by the black tracery of the pines beyond. Snow was still falling, though with less violence than in the night, and I understood at once, with the particular sinking certainty of a man confirming what he already suspects, that we should not be leaving Blackthorn Mere that day, nor perhaps for several days to come. I found Holmes already dressed and standing at the window of our shared sitting-room, his pipe unlit between his fingers, regarding the white waste beyond the glass with an expression I had learned to read as something between satisfaction and calculation. "A remarkable morning, Watson," said he without turning. "The road is gone, the telegraph wire is down somewhere among the pines, and I am told by the manservant that even the shortest path to the stables is now impassable without a shovel. We are, for practical purposes, as isolated as if we had taken ship for the Antarctic. You seem almost pleased by the fact." "I am pleased by very little that inconveniences a client," he said, "but I will own that a house cut off from the world is a house that cannot easily be tampered with from without, nor its secrets easily removed from within. Whatever troubles Sir Edmund, Watson, it troubles him from inside these walls, and the storm has been good enough to draw a circle around the answer." We breakfasted with the household in a dining-room hung with old portraits, ancestors of the Vale line regarding us with the flat, disapproving stare peculiar to oil paint, and I was struck as the meal proceeded by the extraordinary discipline of the establishment. Meals appeared with a punctuality that seemed almost military. The fires in every room we passed were laid and tended at hours evidently fixed by long custom, and when, after breakfast, I chanced to glance down a side passage, I observed a maidservant emerging from what appeared to be a concealed door in the panelling, one of those hidden ways by which old houses allow their servants to pass unseen from room to room. Holmes noticed it as well, though he said nothing at the time. Indeed, he spent the better part of that morning simply walking the house, ostensibly admiring its architecture, in fact cataloguing, I'm certain, every door, every passage, every window latch, with the silent thoroughness of a surveyor. I accompanied him as far as the library, a long room lined floor to ceiling with legal volumes bound in dark calf, where Sir Edmund himself joined us shortly before noon. He looked, I thought, as though he had slept little. There were shadows beneath his eyes that the grey morning light did nothing to soften, and when he spoke it was with the careful evenness of a man who has rehearsed his composure. "You asked me last night, Mr. Holmes, whether the inquest testimony was bound," he said without preamble. "It was. All testimony taken in a coroner's inquest in this county is copied fair and bound into a single volume, kept, in this instance, in that cabinet." He indicated a tall case of dark wood standing between two windows, its glass front reflecting the pale light. "I do not know how one of these notes came to be folded within such a volume, Mr. Holmes, unless it was folded within this one." "That," said Holmes, "is precisely the question I intend to answer. But permit me first to ask a simpler one. You told us the inquest concerned the death of your gamekeeper, one Thomas Rusk, found drowned near a footbridge upon the mere. The verdict was accidental death. Was there any dissent among the jury?" "None. The evidence was clear enough. Rusk had been known to take a dram or two of an evening, and the bridge rail is old and none too sound. He was seen alive at dusk by the stable boy, and found the next morning below the bridge in the shallows, where the ice had not yet closed. Dr. Parentham examined him, and found nothing inconsistent with a fall." "And the boy who saw him last? Is he still in your service?" A curious hesitation crossed Sir Edmund's face, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but not so quickly that Holmes failed to mark it. "Owen Bell. No, he is not. He was sent to relatives in the north not long after the inquest. A restless boy, Mr. Holmes, not suited to service here, and his people were glad enough to have him." "How fortunate for all concerned," said Holmes, in a tone so mild that only I who knew him could have detected the edge beneath it, "that the one witness closest to the death should have removed himself so promptly from the county." Sir Edmund made no answer to this, and the silence that followed was broken only by the small, dry sound of snow ticking against the library windows. It was that evening at dinner that the true temperature of the household first declared itself to me, though I own I did not read its significance until Holmes explained it afterward. The talk had turned, as it seemed always to turn in that house, toward the storm and its inconveniences, and Lady Vale, presiding at the foot of the table with her customary grace, remarked that it was as well the inquest had been concluded before the weather closed in, for all the testimony, she said, had been properly recorded and the matter was entirely closed. "Properly recorded," Holmes repeated, setting down his glass. "Or properly permitted?" It was the smallest of questions, delivered in the mildest of voices, and yet I saw Mr. Crow's hand check itself upon his fork, and I saw Captain Harbury's hearty smile fix itself a fraction too long upon his face, and I saw Dr. Parentham's eyes flicker, just once, towards Sir Edmund at the head of the table. The silence that followed could not have lasted above 2 seconds, before Lady Vale laughed lightly and observed that Mr. Holmes had a lawyer's love of fine distinctions, and the talk moved on to other things. But I had seen it, and Holmes beside me had seen it more clearly still, and when at last we withdrew to our rooms through those cold, dark corridors, he said to me quietly, "Watson, I have asked one question at that table tonight, and 6 people have answered it without one of them opening their mouths. We are not, I think, dealing with a single guilty conscience in this house. We are dealing with a household that has agreed, without ever quite saying so aloud, upon what it will and will not remember." Chapter 3. The Incident in the Locked Library. I was wakened a little after 2 by a sound that no man who has served in the army ever quite forgets. The sharp, ugly crash of something heavy overturned, followed by a silence more alarming than the noise itself. For a moment I lay confused between sleep and waking, uncertain whether the sound had come from within the house or from some drift of snow slipping from the roof. Then I heard Holmes's door open across the passage, and I knew that whatever had happened was real, and that he had heard it before I had fully understood that I had heard it at all. We met in the corridor, he fully dressed as though he had not yet retired, myself in my dressing gown with my revolver from old habit in my pocket. The house was waking about us in a confusion of voices and hurrying feet, candles bobbing at the far end of the gallery, and it was Marston, the steward, who reached the library door before any of us and found it fast. "Locked, sir," he said, rattling the handle with mounting alarm, "and Sir Edmund does not answer." Holmes was on his knees before the door in an instant, his eye to the keyhole, then his fingers testing the gap beneath. "The key is in the lock on the inside," he said. "We must break it in. Captain Harbury, your shoulder, if you please." It took 3 heavy blows before the old lock gave way, and the door swung inward upon a scene that I, as a physician, was perhaps better prepared for than the rest of the household, though it shook me none the less. Sir Edmund lay upon the carpet beside his desk, quite senseless, one hand still outflung as though he had reached for something in falling. The tall glass-fronted cabinet between the windows stood open, its door swinging very slightly, and papers lay scattered upon the floor about it in a disorder that spoke of haste rather than violence. I knelt at once beside him, and found, with some relief, a strong pulse and easy breathing, the pupils reacting normally to the candlelight brought near. There was a small contusion above the temple, consistent, I judged, with striking the corner of the desk in falling, but nothing that suggested a blow delivered by another hand. "He lives," I said, "and I think we'll do well enough, though we must get him to his bed and keep him warm and quiet." Dr. Wrentham had by now pushed through the gathered household and knelt beside me, examining Sir Edmund with a physician's brisk competence that I could find no fault with, though I noted, even in that confusion, that his hands, like Lady Vale's at the tea-table, were not entirely steady. "A seizure," he pronounced after a moment. "Nervous exhaustion, very possibly, brought on by the anxieties of these last days, and by rising in the night and exerting himself in the cold. It happens often enough in men of his age and temperament. He must be kept from all excitement." While I saw to my patient, and while the household busied itself with hot bricks and blankets and the low, urgent murmur of alarm, I was aware of Holmes moving about the room with the swift, silent economy of motion that I had seen in him 100 times before, at 100 scenes of violence, and had never yet grown accustomed to. He examined the windows first, and I heard him remark, almost to himself, that the ice upon the inner pane was undisturbed, a solid, unbroken crust that no hand could have touched without leaving its mark. He examined the door, the lock, the key still standing in it. He knelt beside the desk and studied the lamp, whose wick had burned down low, the oil nearly spent, and beside it a single candle in a silver stick, whose wax, I saw even from where I knelt, showed scarcely any burning at all. "A curious economy," I heard him murmur, "to light a fresh candle and let it stand unused, while the lamp is left to burn itself dry." He rose, and crossed to where a chair stood pushed back from the desk, its position exact and orderly, quite unlike the sprawled disorder of a man who has risen in haste or collapsed in confusion. He touched it, moved it an inch, and frowned. It was upon the floor near the cabinet that he found the thing which, though I did not know it then, was to prove the true key to the whole dark business. A length of narrow legal ribbon, red and faded such as is used to bind bundles of documents, lay half beneath the cabinet's lower shelf. Holmes took it up and drew it slowly between his fingers, and I saw his brows contract. "Watson, come here a moment and tell me what you make of this." I crossed to him and took the ribbon as he held it out. It was perhaps 8 inches in length, cut cleanly at one end, frayed and worn at the other as old ribbons become. "A binding ribbon," I said, "such as your legal cabinet there would be full of. "Feel it," he said, "at each end." I did as he bade me, and found, to my surprise, that the cut end was quite dry, while the worn end, and some inches beyond it, retained a distinct and unmistakable dampness, as of something that had lately been out in the snow. "It is damp," I said, "at the old end, and dry where it has been cut." "Which tells us," said Holmes softly, "that this ribbon was cut this very night, Watson, and that the hand which cut it had come in from the cold not very long before. Sir Edmund, I think we may take it, has not left this house today." He straightened, and his eye travelled once more about the room. Resting last upon the cabinet and the scattered papers at its foot, he knelt again among them, and with great care lifted the bound volume of Inquest testimony, turning its pages slowly beneath the candlelight. Near the middle of the book he paused, and held one page up so that the light fell upon it at a slant. "Look here," he said. "This sheet bears the faint pressure of writing, though it is itself unwritten upon. Something once lay above it in this volume, Watson, written with a firm and heavy hand, and has since been removed." "The suppressed testimony," I said, the phrase from the anonymous notes returning to me suddenly. "You believe it was here, in this very book?" "I believe," said Holmes, replacing the volume with the same care with which he had lifted it, "that it was here until tonight, and that whoever came for it did not come by any door that we have found locked, nor by any window sealed with ice, and yet came, and went, and left this house believing that a collapsed old man and a disordered room would tell no tale at all." He looked down at the ribbon still in my hand. "They did not reckon, I think, upon a chair pushed back too neatly, or a candle too little burned, or a ribbon that remembers the snow." Chapter 4. The Impossible Footprints. "I remember nothing, Doctor, nothing whatever, after I'd said good-night to my wife and taken up my candle for bed." Sir Edmund said this to me the following morning, propped against his pillows with the pallor of a man who has been shaken rather than broken, and I confess I believed him, or believed at least that he believed himself. A physician learns to distinguish the evasions of a frightened man from the honest bewilderment of one whose memory has genuinely failed him, and Sir Edmund's bewilderment had, to my eye, the particular texture of truth. He insisted, moreover, with something approaching agitation, that no document was missing from his cabinet, that all was as it should be, and that his collapse was nothing more than the natural consequence of age and worry. Dr. Wrentham, attending at the bedside with his customary quiet competence, was of the same opinion. "A nervous seizure, pure and simple," he said to me in the passage afterward, "such as I have seen twice before in men of his years, brought on by strain. There is no mystery in it, Dr. Watson, save the mystery of a man driving himself beyond his strength." I relayed this professional judgment to Holmes over a hurried breakfast, and he received it with the particular stillness he reserved for opinions he did not share but did not yet care to contradict aloud. "No mystery," Wrentham says. He buttered his toast with great deliberation. "I wonder, Watson, whether Dr. Wrentham has considered that a man may suffer a genuine seizure and still be the innocent instrument of another's design. The two are not incompatible. Indeed, I begin to suspect they are rather closely related in this case." He rose abruptly, leaving his tea half finished. "Come, the snow has stopped falling, and I have a fancy to see that bridge before some well-meaning soul thinks to clear a path across it and destroy whatever the night has left for us to read." We went out into a morning of hard, brilliant cold, the sky scoured clean and blue above the white desolation of the mere, our breath standing before us in the still air. The path to the footbridge lay some quarter-mile from the house, across what had been, in summer, a stretch of rough pasture, and Holmes went before me with his eyes fixed upon the ground, moving in that curious, stooping, quartering fashion that had earned him, in his younger days, comparisons to a foxhound that I believe secretly pleased him. Captain Harbury had accompanied us, ostensibly out of concern for our safety upon the ice, though I suspected a more particular curiosity, and it was he who observed, as we came within sight of the bridge, that the snow lay unbroken all about it save for old tracks, half-filled and shapeless, that could have been laid at any time before the storm began. "You see, Mr. Holmes," he said, with something of the satisfaction of a man scoring a point, "nothing has crossed this ground since the snow began falling. Whatever happened in that library last night, it did not involve anyone coming out here." "So it would appear," said Holmes mildly, and continued his slow, careful progress toward the bridge without further comment, which I had learned by then to recognise as the surest sign that he had already seen something the captain had not. The footbridge itself was a simple structure of stone piers and a wooden rail, spanning a narrow neck of the mere where the current, even in that hard frost, had kept a channel of black water open beneath a thin, treacherous skin of ice. Holmes examined the rail with great attention, running his gloved hand along its length, and I saw him pause at a section perhaps a yard from the northern end. "Watson, your opinion, as a medical man, upon this?" I came to his side and looked where he indicated. The snow lay evenly along the entire length of the rail, a soft, unbroken cushion perhaps 2 inches deep, save at the one point he had marked, where it lay thinner by half, as though something had rested there and permitted the snow beneath it to settle less generously than elsewhere. "It might be the wind," I offered, though without much conviction. "A drift, thinner in one place than another." "The wind," said Holmes, "has been remarkably consistent in its favours elsewhere along this rail, and remarkably inconsistent at this one point of perhaps 8 inches. I do not think it is the wind, Watson. I think something warm rested here, and rested long enough to thin the snow that fell upon it before it was removed." He crouched and drew off his glove and ran his bare fingers along the underside of the rail at that same point, and when he withdrew them, I saw upon their tips a faint waxy smear. He held it to his nose. "Candle grease," he said quietly, "upon the underside of a bridge rail, in a spot where no lantern would naturally be set, unless a man wished to work with both hands free, and required a light he could fix in place rather than carry." Captain Harbury, who had drawn near enough to overhear this, gave a short laugh that did not entirely convince me of its heartiness. "You will forgive me, Mr. Holmes, if I confess I cannot see where candle grease upon a bridge rail leads us. It might have lain there for months." "It might," Holmes agreed, rising and drawing on his glove once more, "though fresh grease upon weathered wood is a thing a chemist could settle in an afternoon, and I intend that one shall. But I did not come out here this morning searching for who killed Thomas Rusk, Captain. I came searching for something rather more particular and rather more recent." It was on our walk back to the house that the captain, perhaps uneasy at the turn the conversation had taken, began speaking with a great show of frankness about the household's various quarrels, as though eager to lay some other trail before us. Rusk, he said, had fallen out badly with Marston over wages some weeks before his death, a dispute conducted with considerable heat before witnesses. Lady Vale, he added, almost as an aside, had once dismissed Rusk's own sister from her position as a housemaid some years past, in circumstances that had left bad blood between the families, and he himself, he admitted with a rueful frankness that struck me as carefully rehearsed, had exchanged sharp words with Rusk not long before the inquest over some trifling matter of a dog. Holmes listened to all of this with every appearance of polite attention, and said very little, and it was not until we were alone again, tramping the last stretch back toward the house, that he gave me his true opinion of it. 3 motives, Watson, offered to us unasked, each plausible, each convenient, and each, I suspect, entirely beside the point. A man who wishes to hide a small fire will often be very willing to point out 3 larger ones burning elsewhere. He glanced back once toward the bridge, now small and black against the white expanse of the mere. "No, the question that concerns me is not who quarrelled with Thomas Rusk, nor even, perhaps, who caused him to fall from that bridge. The question is who required so many months after his death that the truth of that falling should remain forever unheard. Find me that person, Watson, and I think we shall find our candle and our ribbon, and very possibly our missing page besides." Chapter 5. What was seen, not said. "I shall ask no one, Watson, what they did on the night Thomas Rusk died," Holmes announced as we sat that afternoon in the small morning room that Sir Edmund had placed at his disposal. "Men and women guard their actions very carefully, particularly when those actions touch upon a death. But they guard their scenery hardly at all. Ask a man what he did, and he will have his answer ready, rehearsed and smooth as a stone in a stream. Ask him instead what he saw, the fall of the light, the direction of the wind, the sound beyond the window, and you will very often catch him building a room that does not exist." It was in this spirit that he conducted, over the course of that long grey afternoon, a series of interviews so mild in manner and so apparently trivial in substance, that I confess I wondered for a time whether he had abandoned his inquiry altogether in favour of idle conversation. He asked no one where they had stood, nor what they had done, nor whom they suspected. He asked instead of each visitor to that small room what they remembered of the particular evening of Rusk's death some months before, and he asked it as a man might ask an old friend to help him recall a pleasant dinner, with every appearance of harmless curiosity. Miss Helena Price came first, composed and correct in her plain grey dress, her hands folded before her with the stillness of long practice. "I was in the schoolroom that evening, Mr. Holmes, preparing lessons for the morning. I heard nothing of the matter until the household was roused the next day. A quiet evening then, very quiet. The storm, that is, the wind, was troublesome, and I recall thinking how glad I was to have the shutters fast for the noise of it. And once, I remember, the stable bell rang, quite clear despite the wind, and I wondered idly what had disturbed the horses." Holmes made no remark upon this at the time, beyond a murmur of polite interest, and thanked her for her patience with such warmth that she withdrew, I thought, rather more at ease than she had entered. It was only when the door had closed behind her that he turned to me with a small private satisfaction. "The schoolroom, Watson, lies upon the north side of the house, above the kitchens, and I have walked that passage twice this morning. No bell in this establishment could be heard there through a shuttered window in a gale, unless it were rung directly beneath the sill, which the stable most certainly is not. Miss Price has given us a very pretty evening, complete with weather and incident. I wonder only that she troubled to furnish it with a sound she could never have heard." Mr. Crow followed, precise and dry as ever, and gave an account of himself so orderly that it might have been drafted for a client's approval. He had been in the drawing-room the whole evening, he said, reading, undisturbed, the fire well tended, and he recalled distinctly the pattern of the old Turkey rug beneath his feet, a border of interlocking medallions in red and blue, very handsome. He had often admired it. "A fine old piece," Holmes agreed, "though I understand it was moved to the long gallery some 2 days since for cleaning, and a plainer runner laid in its place. You will have been describing, Mr. Crow, a rug you have not stood upon in the drawing-room for the better part of a week." I watched the little solicitor's composure falter for just a moment, a flicker at the corner of the mouth quickly suppressed, before he recovered himself with a small dry laugh, and observed that one rug was very like another to a man past 50, and that he had doubtless confused his evenings. Holmes accepted this with every appearance of courtesy, and let him go, though I saw, as the door closed, that he had noted the moment down as carefully as if he had written it in a book. It was Dr. Rentham's interview that proved, to my mind, the most instructive of the afternoon, for the physician came to it with far less ease than the others, despite his professional habit of composure. He confirmed, at Holmes's invitation, the particulars of his examination of Rusk's body, the bruising consistent with a fall, the absence of any wound suggesting violence, the cold having preserved the body well enough for a clear finding. "And the injuries," said Holmes, with the mild, incidental air of a man asking after the weather, "were they such as would follow a fall from the north side of the bridge or the south?" It was a small question, and I confess I did not at the time see its weight. But Dr. Drentham's face changed at once, a tightening about the eyes, a stiffening of the shoulders, and his answer, when it came, was sharper than any he had yet given. "I hardly see, Mr. Holmes, that the distinction signifies. A fall is a fall, and the body was recovered from the water below the bridge, whichever side the poor fellow went from. Such fine distinctions are meaningless in a case already closed by proper inquest, and I confess I am at a loss to see why they should concern you now." "Perhaps they do not," said Holmes, with a mildness that I had come to recognise as his most dangerous tone. "And yet I find that the meaningless distinctions are so very often the ones that men are most reluctant to make." Wrentham said nothing further, and took his leave shortly after with rather less than his usual courtesy, and Holmes watched him go with an expression I could not quite read, something between satisfaction and, I thought, a certain reluctant sympathy. When we were alone again, the fire burning low and the early winter dusk gathering at the windows, Holmes stretched his long legs toward the hearth and regarded me with the particular brightness that meant a piece of the puzzle had settled into place. "You will have observed, Watson, that I have learned nothing today of who stood where, nor who quarrelled with whom, nor any of the plain facts a policeman would set down in his notebook. And yet I have learned a very great deal. I have learned that Miss Price will furnish a false evening rather than confess an empty one. I have learned that Mr. Crow cannot remember his own drawing-room without borrowing details a week out of date. And I have learned that Dr. Wrentham, of all people in this house, cannot bear to be asked a question about the manner of a dead man's fall, though he has answered 100 such questions in his professional life without a flicker." "What does it mean, Holmes?" "It means," he said slowly, "that people lie most carefully about the large matters of a night, Watson, the where and the why, because they have had months to prepare their answers, but they betray themselves over the small matters, the furniture, the weather, the ringing of a bell, because no one thinks to rehearse a lie about a rug. I begin to believe that very few people in this house are lying to protect themselves from an accusation of murder. I begin to believe, rather, that a great many people in this house are lying to protect one single truth, and that each of them has been permitted to know only enough of it to make himself a very poor liar indeed." Chapter 6. Silent Agreements. It began, as so much of that inquiry seemed to begin, with something so small that I should never have remarked upon it myself. Holmes had taken to wandering the house at odd hours, ostensibly admiring its antiquities, and on the second morning after our interviews in the small room, he returned to our quarters with a notebook full of figures and an expression of quiet, contained excitement that I had learned to value above almost any other sign in him. "Watson, how many clocks would you say stand in this house?" I confessed I had not counted them, though I supposed a dozen at least in a house of that size. 14 by my reckoning that keep time at all, and I have compared every one of them this morning against my own watch, which I set by the London train, and have had no occasion to doubt since. He consulted his notebook. 12 of the 14 agree with one another and with my watch to within a minute, which is as much accuracy as one has any right to expect of a country house. But 2 do not agree, Watson. The hall clock and the small clock in the gun-room both run some 7 minutes fast, and both, I am reliably informed by a housemaid I found dusting the gun-room this morning, were adjusted to that error upon the same afternoon some months ago by the same hand. Whose hand? That is precisely what I set myself to discover, and I had my answer within the half hour, for servants, Watson, are a good deal less practised in silence than their masters, and a shilling loosens a tongue that a magistrate's frown would only close the tighter. He seated himself and regarded the fire. It was Mr. Crow who requested that the hall clock be sent for repair the very morning after Rusk's death, though the clock, by every account, had not been broken at all. The gun-room clock he adjusted with his own hand, the same housemaid tells me, on the pretext of comparing it to his pocket watch. 7 minutes, Watson, is not a great deal of time, but it is enough, I think, to move the apparent hour of a man's last sighting alive by 7 minutes, and 7 minutes, upon a night when every account depends upon the precise striking of a distant bell, may be the whole difference between an alibi that holds and one that does not. I own I found this a slender thread upon which to hang so large a conclusion. But Holmes was not yet finished, and the threads, slender as they were, had begun that day to gather themselves into something like a rope. It was Marston, of all people, who provided the next strand, and he provided it, I think, less from any wish to assist us than from a steward's old habit of accounting for everything that passed under his authority. Holmes had asked him, in the most casual manner, about the routine of locking the house of an evening, and Marston, glad perhaps to speak of some matter that did not touch his own conscience, answered readily enough. The west passage is generally locked at 10, Mr. Holmes, when the last of the fires are seen to, but on the night Rusk died, her ladyship gave particular orders that it be locked at 8:30, a full hour and more before its custom, and told me herself that the wind was rising and she would have no draughts through the house that night. And did the wind, in fact, rise unusually early that evening? Marston considered this with the slow deliberation of a man revisiting a memory he had not previously examined. Now that you put it to me so, Mr. Holmes, I could not honestly say that it did. I recall it coming on hard enough after midnight, but at 8:30 I believe it was a still enough evening, for the time of year. Holmes thanked him with a warmth that seemed to please the old steward greatly, and it was not until Marston had gone that he permitted himself, in my presence, the smallest of satisfied smiles. The west passage, Watson, leads by the shortest way to the mere and the bridge. Lady Vale locked it an hour before its custom, upon a still evening, some hours before the wind she cited had troubled so much as a leaf. I begin to think, Watson, that her ladyship wished very particularly that no one should pass that way that night, and that she had her reasons ready before ever the wind obliged her by rising at all. The last, and to my mind, the most affecting of that day's small confessions came from Miss Price herself, who sought Holmes out that evening, of her own accord in a state of visible agitation quite unlike her earlier composure. Mr. Holmes, I have not been entirely open with you, and it weighs upon me more than I can say. She twisted her hands together as she spoke. On the evening you asked me of, I did not spend the whole time in the schoolroom, as I told you. Sir Edmund sent me, a little before 9, to carry a sealed note to Dr. Wrentham, who was then in his own house in the village, a walk of perhaps 20 minutes each way. I did not read it, Mr. Holmes. I give you my word I did not, though I confess I wondered greatly at its urgency, and at being sent out upon such an errand at such an hour. And you returned by the west passage? I could not, sir, for it was locked, and I was obliged to come round by the kitchen yard instead, which cost me some further minutes and no little discomfort in the cold. I said nothing of this before because Sir Edmund asked that the errand be kept private, and because, God forgive me, I did not wish to seem to accuse anyone of anything. Holmes released her from her distress with great gentleness, and it was only when we were alone that he permitted the full weight of what she had told us to settle upon his features. A note, sent in haste and secrecy from magistrate to physician, upon the very evening of a gamekeeper's death, and a passage locked against her return, Watson. I think we are very near now to understanding what this household has agreed, without a word of formal conspiracy to protect. He rose and paced the length of the small room, his hands clasped behind him. Sir Edmund tells us the boy Owen Bell, who saw Rusk last, was sent north to relatives shortly after the inquest, a restless boy not suited to service. I have written today to a colleague in Yorkshire who owes me a small service, asking him to find that boy, if he can be found, and to learn from him, in his own words, what he saw that night upon the bridge, before ever an inquest told him what he was permitted to remember. You believe the boy saw something more than a simple fall? I believe, said Holmes, that Owen Bell saw a figure near that bridge at an hour when, by the inquest's own account, Thomas Rusk was already dead. And I believe that every soul in this house, from its master to its youngest housemaid, has spent these last months in a silent and entirely voluntary agreement, never, under any circumstances, to ask him what that hour truly was. Chapter 7. The Discovery in the Chapel. Mr. Holmes, come at once, all of you, come and see what I've found. Captain Harbury's voice, ringing down the stone passage that led to the old chapel, brought the household running in a manner that no summons of Holmes's own devising had yet achieved, and I confess my own heart quickened at the note of triumph in it. We found him standing just within the chapel door, a small disused place of worship dating, Sir Edmund told us afterward, from the days when the family had kept its own chaplain, cold and bare and smelling of dust and old stone, with a single narrow window admitting the grey afternoon light. He held in his hand a scrap of paper, torn raggedly along one edge, and his face wore the flushed, eager look of a man who believes himself, for once, to have outpaced the great detective at his own game. Beneath the kneeler, Mr. Holmes, the old one before the altar rail, I came in only to see whether the chapel had been searched, and I found the boards loose beneath it, and this hidden in the cavity below. Holmes took the paper from him and held it to the light, and I crowded close enough to read it over his shoulder. It was, unmistakably, a fragment of the inquest testimony, the fair legal hand unmistakable even in so short a passage, and it named, in a sentence that seemed to leap from the page, a figure seen near the footbridge on the night of Rusk's death, the said figure being that of Albel Marston, steward to the estate. The effect upon the household, gathered now in a close and murmuring knot within that cold chapel, was immediate and profound. I saw Marston's face, already pale from the season, drained to a colour I had seen before only in men receiving a mortal diagnosis, and it was perhaps 30 seconds only before he broke, there among the old pews, in a manner more painful to witness than any confession I had yet heard in my years beside Holmes. "It is true," he said, his voice thick and unsteady. "I was near the bridge that night, God forgive me, though not for the reason you will think. I had taken money, Sir Edmund, small sums over these 2 years past, from the estate accounts, thinking to repay it before it should be missed, and Rusk had found me out. He meant to tell you of it. I went to beg him to hold his tongue a little longer, only that, I swear it upon anything you care to name, and when I found him gone from the place we had agreed to meet, I feared the worst and dared not speak of having been there at all, lest I be thought to have had a hand in whatever became of him. It was, I own, a confession delivered with every appearance of genuine anguish, and I saw in the faces about me, in Sir Edmund's grave nod, in Lady Vale's hand pressed to her lips, in Captain Harbury's satisfied certainty, the settling of a great collective relief, as though a fever long endured had at last broken. Here, surely, was the suppressor of the testimony, the man whose guilty presence at the bridge had made the true record of that night too dangerous to let stand. I found myself, I confess, very nearly persuaded. The evidence was direct, the confession heartfelt, the motive plain and sordid and entirely human, theft and the fear of discovery, and I thought, as I watched Marston sink onto a pew with his head in his hands, that we had come at last to the miserable centre of the affair. Holmes alone remained unmoved, standing a little apart with the torn fragment still in his hand, his eyes moving not upon the weeping steward, but upon the loose boards of the kneeler itself, and upon the thick undisturbed dust that lay upon the chapel floor about it, dust broken only by a single trail of recent footprints leading to the very spot where Captain Harbury had knelt. "This chapel, I am told, has been locked since before the storm began," he said, to no one in particular, though the murmur in the room quieted at once to hear him. "Who, then, has had occasion to enter it these last several days?" "I had the key from Marston himself only this morning," said Captain Harbury, a shade too quickly, I thought. "I confess I had a fancy to see the old place, having heard it spoken of, and thought I might as well be of some use in the searching, since you and Watson have had the running of the inquiry so entirely to yourselves." "Very public-spirited," said Holmes, in a tone that gave nothing away, and turned the torn fragment once more to the light. He studied it a long moment, longer, I thought, than its brief content warranted, running his thumb very lightly along the torn edge, and then, with a small private frown that I alone, perhaps in that gathering, understood to be significant, He folded it carefully and placed it within his notebook. "We have, I think, learned a great deal this afternoon," he said aloud, "though I confess I should like an hour or two of quiet before I say precisely what. Sir Edmund, I would ask that Marston be neither accused nor released from suspicion until I have had opportunity to examine this discovery more closely. A confession, gentlemen, is a fine thing, but it is not evidence, and I have known confessions before now to be offered by men guilty of one sin in the fervent hope of being believed innocent of a greater." There was some murmuring at this, Captain Harbury in particular seeming put out that his discovery should be received with anything less than immediate triumph, but Sir Edmund, weakened still and grateful, I think, for any authority willing to take the burden of decision from his own shoulders, agreed readily enough, and the household dispersed by degrees, leaving Holmes and myself alone in the cold chapel with the loose kneeler and the settling dust. "You do not believe him, Holmes," I said when we were quite alone, and yet his distress seemed to me entirely genuine. "His distress, Watson, I do not doubt for a moment. Marston is guilty of something, and guilty men weep very readily when a smaller sin is mistaken for a larger one, out of a species of relief that I have observed before and always found instructive." He knelt beside the disturbed kneeler and examined the loose boards themselves, running his fingers along their edges. "But consider this room. Locked, we are told, since before the storm its dust undisturbed save by one man's boots this very afternoon. And consider this fragment, torn from a bound volume with an edge that should, by every rule of paper and time, show some yellowing, some softening, along its torn margin, as old paper always does when freshly parted from its binding. I shall want a stronger light in my glass before I say more, Watson, but I will tell you this much now. I do not believe that page has lain beneath that kneeler for one day longer than it has taken someone in this house to place it there, and I begin to suspect that Mr. Marston's very genuine tears are about to be made to do a great deal of work for a guilt that is not, in its full extent, his own. Chapter 8. The False Confession Takes Root. Constable Higgins arrived at Blackthorn Mere a little before noon on the third day of our confinement, having come the last 2 miles on foot through drifts that had left him red-faced and breathless, his uniform sodden to the knee. He was a broad, capable-looking man of the sort the country constabulary does well to produce, methodical rather than clever, and he received the household's account of Marston's confession with the evident satisfaction of a man to whom a difficult morning's business has been made suddenly and gratifyingly simple. "Well, that's plain enough, then," he said, when Captain Harbury had finished laying the matter before him, with rather more embellishment, I thought, than strict accuracy required. "Theft from the estate, the gamekeeper finding him out, the man near the bridge the very night he died. I'll take him into the village directly the road allows it, and glad I am the storm has been no worse hindrance than it has." Sir Edmund, propped in a chair by the library fire and still pale from his ordeal, received this news with a long unsteady sigh that I took, at the time, for simple relief. "Then it is over," he said. "Whatever poor Rusk's death may have owed to misfortune or to malice, I am glad, at least, that this shadow may now be lifted from my house." Lady Vale, seated near him, pressed a handkerchief briefly to her eyes, and Captain Harbury accepted the murmured congratulations of the room with the modest bearing of a man who knows himself, this once, to be genuinely deserving of them. Holmes alone took no part in the general relief, standing a little apart near the window with his arms folded, and his eyes moving slowly, thoughtfully, from face to face, in a manner that I had come to recognise as anything but idle. "Before you take him, Constable," he said at last, "I wonder if I might trouble the household with a few questions of my own, small matters merely, that I should like settled for my own satisfaction before the case is considered closed." Constable Higgins, who had been given to understand, I gathered, that the great detective's presence at Blackthorn Mere was a courtesy to be respected, rather than an authority to be questioned, agreed readily enough, and Holmes proceeded to ask a series of questions so modest in their apparent scope that I saw more than one face in the room relax under them, mistaking, as I very nearly did myself, their triviality for harmlessness. He asked who precisely held keys to the chapel, and learned that there were but two, one kept by Marston in his capacity as steward, and one of considerable age and seldom used, kept upon a ring in the housekeeper's pantry, accessible, in practice, to any member of the household who troubled to ask for it. He asked who among them had known, before this week, that old legal papers were sometimes stored beneath loose flooring, or within disused fittings about the estate, a custom, Sir Edmund admitted, dating from his grandfather's day, when such hiding places had once concealed papers of a delicate political nature during troubled times. And he asked, last of all, and most casually, who had handled the bound volume of inquest testimony since the night of Sir Edmund's collapse in the library. "I locked the cabinet myself the following morning," said Mr. Crow, "and have kept the key upon my own person since, as the family's legal adviser, it seeming to me the natural custody for such papers." "You have not, then, examined the volume itself in that time? Turned its pages, perhaps, to satisfy yourself nothing further was amiss?" "I glanced through it certainly the morning after the incident to confirm the record was intact. I found nothing wanting." Holmes thanked him with every appearance of satisfaction, and the questioning ended there, the household dispersing with the settled air of people who believe a disagreeable chapter of their lives to have been closed. Constable Higgins among them, well pleased with a morning's work that had cost him so little exertion of his own faculties. It was not until the household had gone about its business, and the library stood empty save for ourselves, that Holmes drew from his notebook the torn fragment Captain Harbury had found beneath the chapel kneeler, and carried it to the tall window, where the clear winter light fell strongest upon the desk. "Bring me my lens from the case, Watson, and the small bottle of iodine solution beside it. I have wanted a proper examination of this since the moment it was found, and I have had at last both the light and the leisure for it." I brought him what he asked, and watched as he laid the fragment flat upon a sheet of white paper and bent over it with his glass, in that attitude of intense, silent concentration that I had seen him hold, on occasion, for the better part of an hour without stirring. "The ink," he said presently, "is old, Watson, unmistakably so. See how it has settled into the fibre of the paper, browning very slightly at the edges of each stroke, a process that requires months, not days. This much of the document is genuine enough, torn, I have no doubt, from the true bound testimony taken at the inquest." He paused and touched the torn edge itself with the very tip of his finger. "But the tear, Watson, is fresh. See how the fibres stand up pale and raw along this margin, quite unweathered, quite unlike the soft yellowed appearance that even a few weeks' exposure would produce. This page was torn from its binding very recently indeed, I should say within the last several days, and very possibly within the last several hours before it was found." "But the writing itself, Holmes, the sentence naming Marston, surely that at least is of a piece with the rest." He bent lower still, the lens almost touching the paper, and was silent for a long moment before he answered. "No," he said at last very quietly, "it is not. Look here, at the pressure of the downstrokes in this final sentence, compared with those above it. The earlier lines were written with a steady, even pressure, the hand of a clerk long practised in fair copying, unhurried, uniform. But this sentence, the one sentence in the whole fragment that names our steward, is written with a heavier, more urgent pressure, the strokes a fraction wider, the rhythm subtly quickened, as though the hand that formed it worked faster and under greater strain than the hand that formed all that came before. It is, I should say, the same ink, very possibly taken from the very inkwell that produced the genuine record. But it is not, I am now quite certain, the same moment, nor, I begin to suspect, the same intention. Someone in this house, Watson, took a genuine page from a genuine record, and added to it, in a matching hand and a borrowed ink, one single sentence that was never spoken at any inquest, true or suppressed, and then tore it fresh and buried it beneath old dust, that it might be discovered at precisely the hour when this household most wished to believe its troubles ended. He straightened at last and folded the fragment away with a care that seemed, to my eye, almost gentle, as though he handled not a forgery but a small, sad testament to the desperation of whoever had made it. Marston is guilty of theft, Watson, and will answer for it in due course, and I do not doubt his tears in that chapel were honest tears, wept for a lesser sin he feared would be mistaken for a greater one. But he did not suppress the truth of Thomas Rusk's death, and whoever built this confession for him to fall into has done something a great deal more calculated and a great deal more dangerous than a frightened man's theft from an estate account. I think, Watson, we had better let Constable Higgins keep his prisoner a little while longer, out of the cold if nothing else, but I do not think we shall let him leave this house believing the matter closed. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the night. The thaw had not yet properly begun, but the wire, at least, had been mended by some enterprising linesmen from the village, and it was by that restored telegraph that Holmes's answer came from Yorkshire on the morning of our 4th and, as it proved, our final day at Blackthorn Mere. He read it standing by the breakfast table, and I saw his face, generally so guarded, betray for a moment something very like grim satisfaction. "It is as I thought, Watson," he said, passing me the flimsy sheet. "My colleague has found the boy Owen Bell, and has had from him, in his own artless words, an account he was never asked to give at any inquest. We have, I think, all that we require. Be so good as to ask Sir Edmund whether the household might be gathered in the library within the hour. I believe it time we brought this matter to its true conclusion." They came as bidden, some hour later, into a library still bearing, in the cabinet's careful order and the desk's cleared surface, the marks of the disorder Holmes had studied there 4 nights before. Sir Edmund sat by the fire, still weak but composed, Lady Vale beside him, her hands folded with a stillness that seemed to cost her some effort. Mr. Crowe, Captain Harbury, Dr. Wrentham and Marston, the last under the constable's watchful but no longer wholly certain eye, completed the circle, while Miss Price stood a little apart near the window, as she had, I thought, throughout our whole strange sojourn in that house. Holmes stood before the fire, his hands clasped behind him, and began, as I had heard him begin so many times before, quietly, almost gently, as though reluctant to disturb the silence he was about to shatter. "I must first correct an error that this household, and the inquest before it, has laboured under for some months," he said. "Thomas Rusk did not die at the moment, nor in the manner that the official record supposes. He fell from that bridge, yes, struck perhaps by ice underfoot, or by a blow I have found no evidence to support, and I do not believe murder was intended by any hand in this room. But he did not die at once. He lay some while in the shallows, injured, conscious, and was seen and heard by the one witness this house took such pains to silence, the stable boy, Owen Bell." A stillness had fallen upon the room that I had felt before, in other libraries, at other conclusions, the particular silence of people who sense a door closing behind them. "Owen Bell has told my colleague what he told no coroner," Holmes continued. "He saw that night not a struggle, not a crime of violence, but a woman kneeling upon the bank beside the injured man, speaking to him with great urgency, while he weakly refused her something she asked of him. His eyes moved not unkindly to Lady Vale. You went to him, madam, not to harm him, but to beg the return of a packet of letters that would have revealed an old and damaging error in your husband's conduct as magistrate, years before this present trouble, an error Rusk had somehow come into possession of proof of, and had threatened, I think, to use against you both. Lady Vale's face had gone the colour of the snow beyond the windows, but she said nothing, and it was Sir Edmund who spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Go on, Mr. Holmes. Rusk died there upon the bank some while after the fall that Owen Bell witnessed, not instantly as the record claims, but slowly, from cold and injury together. Dr. Wrentham, summoned that same night by a note carried in haste by Miss Price, examined the body and found, I do not doubt a truth too dangerous to record faithfully, that the time and manner of death did not match the story the household required. Loyalty to this family, Doctor, and I believe it was loyalty and nothing baser, led you to adjust your medical findings to fit a simpler tale, an accidental fall, a swift death, no lingering, no witness, no scandal. Wrentham's head had sunk low, and he made no attempt at denial. Mr. Crowe, as the family's man of law, undertook the more delicate work of ensuring the official record reflected this simpler tale, and of seeing that Owen Bell's true account never reached the coroner's ear at all. Sir Edmund, discovering, I believe, only after the inquest was closed, the full extent of what had been done in his name and his wife's protection, could not bring himself to expose it, and instead hid the boy's true statement, torn from the fair copy, within the very volume that should have contained it whole. I could not, Sir Edmund said very low, I could not destroy both my wife and my own name, Mr. Holmes, upon the discovery of a wrong I had not myself committed, though God knows I have paid for the silence since. The anonymous notes began some weeks ago, Holmes went on, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove it beyond doubt, that they came from Owen Bell himself, restless in his northern exile and troubled by a conscience his youth had not yet learned to quiet, a boy who knew a great wrong had been done and lacked the means to right it, save by these small, haunting reminders. Those notes threw this household into an anxiety that made discovery seem imminent, and it was that anxiety, Dr. Wrentham, that led you to a second and far graver error. The physician looked up at last, his face grey. You determined that the hidden testimony must be destroyed beyond any further danger of discovery, and you undertook, upon the night of Sir Edmund's collapse, to remove it from the cabinet yourself. You didn't enter by any door that violence could break, nor any window that the ice had not already sealed. You came, I think, by the servants' passage that opens near the library, a way that does not touch the outer snow at all, and you had, from your long attendance upon this family in matters medical and domestic, a duplicate key to that cabinet made perhaps in some innocent hour years before and never surrendered. You found Sir Edmund there before you, roused perhaps by his own troubled conscience, and in the confusion of that meeting, whether by his collapse alone or by some lesser struggle none here will now dispute, he fell, and you, doctor in genuine alarm for a man you had attended for 20 years, summoned help, but not before you had secured the volume and slipped from the room and locked it behind you from without, using a hooked wire through the keyhole to turn a key you yourself had left standing there, a trick any locksmith could demonstrate to Constable Higgins within the hour should he doubt it. The candle grease upon the bridge rail was yours also, I think, from some earlier visit to that spot made in secrecy to satisfy yourself of what remained to be found there. And when suspicion in these last days threatened to settle too near your own door, you conceived, I believe alone, the desperate expedient of the chapel, a fresh tear in an old page, a borrowed hand, a confession of theft that Marston, guilty of a lesser sin, could be relied upon to embrace as the whole of his guilt, rather than see himself accused of what he had not done. It was neatly conceived, Doctor, and very nearly successful, but a chair pushed back too precisely, a candle too little burned, a ribbon that remembered the snow, and a tear in old paper that had not yet learned to be old, none of these could be made to agree with the story you required of them. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft collapse of coal upon the grate, and by Dr. Wrentham's voice, when at last he found it, quiet and utterly without defiance. I did it for this family, Mr. Holmes. I have served them 30 years. I do not know how to be sorry for the intention, only for the manner of it. That, Doctor, said Holmes gravely, is a distinction the law, and I dare say your own conscience, must now be left to weigh. Chapter 10. The Thaw at Blackthorn Mere. There is a particular sound that a great house makes when a long frost begins at last to break. A soft, continuous dripping from eave and gutter, the occasional heavy slide of snow loosening from the roof, and beneath it all a kind of sigh, as though the building itself had been holding its breath against the cold and might now cautiously let it go. I woke to that sound on our 5th morning at Blackthorn Mere, and knew, before I'd even drawn back the curtain, that the world beyond our windows had begun to soften. The road to the village, impassable for the better part of a week, opened by early afternoon to a cart and then, by evening, to Constable Higgins's own trap, in which he departed at last with 2 passengers rather than the one he had arrived expecting to take. Dr. Wrentham went quietly without protest, carrying with him, I thought, something of the same grave dignity with which he had practised medicine in that county for 30 years, a dignity that his crime had bent but had not, in the end, entirely broken. Mr. Crow followed some days later, once the full particulars of the altered record had been laid before the proper authorities. His professional ruin as certain and, I confess, as thoroughly earned as any I have witnessed in Holmes's long career. For a solicitor who bends the law to protect a family forfeits, in that bending, the only claim his profession makes upon respect. Marston remained to the surprise of some, though not to Holmes's, for the theft he had confessed was real enough, and would answer to the law in its own time and its own proportion, a matter of restitution and disgrace rather than the gallows he had wept, in that cold chapel, to imagine himself facing. Sir Edmund, I understood before we left, meant to deal with the matter privately, and with what mercy the circumstances allowed, for the steward's sin, however real, had been made to carry a weight of blackmail and forgery that was never rightly his own, and even a magistrate, I think, may find room for proportion when he has lately learned how easily large wrongs are dressed in small men's clothing. It was Lady Vale who spoke to me alone, on our last evening beneath that roof, finding me by chance in the long gallery as I stood looking out over grounds now patched with dark, wet earth where the snow had begun to withdraw. "I did not kill him, Dr. Watson," she said without preamble, "whatever you may have thought, hearing Mr. Holmes speak this morning. I went to him only to beg, and he refused me, weakly, stubbornly, even as he lay injured, and I did not fully understand how gravely. I left him there, believing he would recover enough to walk home, as he had walked home from worse falls before. I did not know, until Dr. Wrentham came to me long after, what the cold and the water had truly done. 'I believe you,' I said, and found, to my own surprise, that I did. My fear was not of the law, Dr. Watson, not truly. It was of my husband's face. Could he ever learn what folly of my own youth had placed those letters in another man's power to begin with? That fear let others build a lie I never asked for and could not, once it stood, find the courage to tear down." She looked out at the thawing grounds a long while before she spoke again. "Sir Edmund knows all of it now. He has said he will forgive it, and I believe that he means to try, though I do not know that either of us will find it an easy road. I offered what comfort a stranger passing through a house may honestly offer, which is not a great deal, and left her to her thoughts, reflecting as I made my way back to Holmes upon how very often the gravest wrongs in his cases grew not from wickedness but from fear, a fear of scandal, of shame, of a good name tarnished, that led ordinary, even decent people to small deceptions which then compounded, each protecting the last, until an innocent man's memory lay buried beneath a structure none of them had ever quite intended to build." Owen Bell's true statement, forwarded at last by Holmes's Yorkshire colleague and formally sworn before a proper magistrate of a neighbouring county, was entered into the record within the fortnight, correcting, so far as the law is able to correct such things, the account of Thomas Rusk's death. It could not restore the man his life, nor undo the months during which a household of otherwise honourable people had permitted a lie to stand between them and a simple grave, but it restored at least the truth of how he came to lie in it, which Holmes always maintained in his quieter moments was very nearly as important as justice itself. We took our leave of Blackthorn Mere on a morning of pale, watery sunshine, the mere itself beginning to show dark water at its centre where the ice had started at last to yield, and Sir Edmund, though still grey and diminished by all he had learned, came out to the drive to see us into the trap with a courtesy that had survived, I was glad to see, the wreck of so much else about him. "I do not know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes," he said. "For a truth I confess I did not at the outset wholly wish to know." "The truth, Sir Edmund," said Holmes, "is very rarely convenient, and very often merciful all the same, though it takes a longer view than most of us are given to seeing at the time." He shook the old magistrate's hand, and we were driven away at last through a countryside no longer white, but a soft mottled brown and grey, streaked here and there with the last stubborn drifts lying in the shadow of hedgerows. I did not speak for some while, turning over in my mind the whole strange architecture of that case. The clocks moved 7 minutes, the ribbon damp at one end and dry at the other, the candle scarcely burned, the tear in old paper that had not yet learned age. It was Holmes, gazing out at the retreating chimneys of Blackthorn Mere, who broke the silence at last. "Men speak of snow as a thing that conceals crime, Watson, that blankets a countryside and hides whatever passes over it. I have never found it so. Snow, in my experience, preserves the shape of every movement across it with a fidelity that no ordinary ground can match. The weight of a man's step, the pause where he stood undecided, the place where something warm rested and thinned the fall above it. It conceals nothing. It only waits, very patiently, for someone willing to read it before the thaw comes and takes the record away." He said no more upon the subject, and I did not press him, content, as I have so often been content, to carry away from one of his cases not merely the solution of a single death, but some fragment of that larger, quieter wisdom, by which he seemed, always, to see a little further into the shape of things than the rest of us are given to see.